worried about the future? It's hard not to be if you watch the news. It's mostly negative. Violence, disasters, danger, and I suppose that's our job, to tell you about problems. If the plane crashes, that's news. The fact that thousands of planes will land and take off safely during this TV program is a miracle, but it's not news. So we soak in disasters and heed warnings about the next one. Bird flu is going to kill us. Global warming, pesticide residues. I've covered hundreds of scares, and finally I wised up and tried to put things in perspective. In England, a journalist smarter than I was quicker to realize he'd been focusing on the wrong things. It led to this book, The Rational Optimist. Matt Ridley now gives lectures around the world explaining why he's an optimist. You went into this assuming things were getting worse.
Back in the 1970s, the future was bleak. You know, the population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, pesticides were going to shorten our lives, bird flu was going to kill us, the ice age was coming back, acid rain was killing forests, all these, the desert was advancing, the Y2K computer bug, all these things were going to go wrong. And that's what everybody said to me about the future. And so I was kind of surprised when I grew up to find that actually things had been getting better, much better for most people most of the time.
Some people call this pessimism porn or fear porn. It sells in the media. People want to be scared.
It sounds kind of wiser to talk about what might go wrong than to talk about what might go right. It seems kind of foolish to talk about what might go right. So on the whole, there's much more market for bad news than good news.
And you mentioned overpopulation. When I was in college, that was the scare that they were selling me. The book, The Population Bomb, was a bestseller. The author warned that the 1980s would bring mass starvation because population growth would have outrun the food supply. And the population did double. He said there'd be mass starvation by the 80s. The 80s came and went without a shortage of food. Yet some in the media continue to shriek about unsustainable population growth. There are now 7 billion people on Earth.
If we do nothing, it'll go up to 9. And at some point, there's not going to be enough stuff for everybody.
Really? And here's another wrinkle. Since global warming's now the hyped scare of the moment,
should mandatory population control become a part of the fight against global warming?
Mandatory population control. So how would that work? A government official would come to your house, Matt, and forcibly tie our tubes?
Well, that's roughly what happened in China for the last 30 years. There has been mandatory population control. It's been extraordinarily cruel and with a huge amount of suffering involved. And it's unnecessary because it turns out that population growth rates have been falling all around the world, whether you've had mandatory or voluntary control. Because all you have to do is give people a bit more prosperity, a bit more wealth, a bit more education. And it turns out that if their kids stop dying, they have fewer kids.
These days, the media are hyping crime and terrorism, and there is a reason to be fearful. Almost 3,000 people did die on September 11th, and there have been mass shootings, often in schools. The head of the NRA recently said, "This is why we need guns."
There are terrorists, home invaders, drug cartels, carjackers, knockout gamers, rapers, haters, campus killers, airport killers.
He goes on, and those things have happened, and there are good reasons why people should be allowed to have guns, but it upsets me to see the head of the NRA hyping this stuff.
Crime is declining. Violence is declining all around the world to an extraordinary extent. I mean, the number of rapes, the number of murders, are going down steadily in countries like the United States, and the number of people killed in warfare globally was the lowest in the last decade of any decade since records began. That may not feel like it to us in the West because of Iraq and Afghanistan, but it was true globally that we are seeing much less violence around the world.
And yet, if you survey people and ask them if that's true, I would think most just would not believe that.
Because we're constantly being told about the violence that's happening and not told about the gradual trend towards less violence of all kinds.
Finally, Matt, many people still envy the life royalty once lived. Oh, to be a king in the good old days. And yet, you made a video for your book pointing out that today, most of us live better than kings once did, even though the kings had hundreds of servants.
Consider Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis chose from 40 dishes every night, taking 498 people to prepare each meal. Today's average person can go into a supermarket and buy a fresh, frozen, tinned, smoked or pre-prepared meal made with beef, chicken, pork, lamb, fish, eggs, potatoes, beans, carrots. Or he can choose to eat from scores of nearby restaurants, Italian, Chinese, Japanese or Indian, each of which has a team of skilled chefs waiting to serve at less than an hour's notice. Add all this up and you realize that you have far more than 498 servants at your beck and call.
We've effectively got thousands and thousands of people working for us. That's what the system of commerce is. It's a collaborative, cooperative system.
Thank you, Matt Ridley. Here's another reason that the good old days were not as good as today. Most everything is smaller, faster, lighter, denser, cheaper. That's the title of Robert Bryce's new book. What do you mean smaller, faster, lighter, and so on?
Well, John, look at, I carry a cell phone in my pocket, a smartphone. It has 250,000 times more digital storage capacity than the computer that went to the moon. The other day I bought an iPod Nano, holds as much music as 300 LPs. On an efficiency basis, it's 2,000 times lighter and 6,000 times more efficient by volume than an LP.
The progress haters take this and say, and so we're overwhelmed with choice. This doesn't make our lives better.
Sorry, overwhelmed with choice?
Yeah, I don't use most of the stuff on my cell phone. It's too complicated.
Fair enough, but let's look beyond that. Let's look at smaller computers. Let's look at faster communications, denser engines, denser agriculture. All of these things have allowed increasing living standards all over the world.
I like a line from your book. All this may be true, but some people aren't happy unless they're scared and miserable.
Well,
what do you mean?
Well, sure. No politician ever got elected, John, by saying everything's going to be okay. Right? The devil is at the door. You have to elect me, and if you don't elect me, then certainly ruination will come. So this is part of the, the media. If it bleeds, it leads. That is something that we see all the time. And yet this continuing increase in living standards all over the world has been truly remarkable.
Now, I'm old, and all my life I've heard, we're going to run out of oil. Almost 40 years ago, my president told me we had to have an unpleasant talk about the energy crisis.
This is the greatest challenge that our country will face during our lifetime. The energy crisis has not yet overwhelmed us, but it will if we do not act quickly. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources.
Our rapidly shrinking resources.
Isn't that remarkable? If you look back...
Well, it's logical, yeah. We're using stuff, so the resources must be shrinking.
Sure, but what's happening? Better drill rigs, better drill bits, better seismic technology. Their new technologies are allowing effectively computer sensors at the edge of the drill bit. So let's look back at history. 2005, Lee Raymond, the chairman of ExxonMobil, said, natural gas production has peaked in North America. What's happened? Natural gas production today in the U.S. is 41% higher than it was in 2005. And the U.S. now is producing so much natural gas, we're looking at exporting natural gas.
On page 180 of your book, I like the list. In 1914, the U.S. Bureau of Mines said oil supplies would be depleted within 10 years.
Sure.
So in 20 years, we still have oil. Department of Interior says they'll be gone in 13 years. In 1946, maybe we have 20 years left, says the State Department. The Department of Interior again in 1951 depleted, they like the 13-year number.
Of course. And yet what's happened, just January of this year, 2014, the U.S. exported, I repeat, the U.S. exported an average of 4 million barrels of oil a day, almost all of it in the form of gasoline and refined products. The reality is the more oil and gas we find, the more oil and gas we find.
All right, you're cherry-picking oil and gas. We're going to run out of other stuff, maybe food.
John Boyce, who's an economist at University of Calgary, and he looked at prices of industrial commodities over more than 100 years. And what did he find? For the overwhelming majority of them, they fell in price.
And if it falls in price, that means there's more of it, and that's why it falls in price.
The combination of price and innovation is a remarkably powerful combination, and that's what we've seen. The effort towards smaller, faster, lighter, denser, cheaper is happening all around us.
But given that we've seen it, why can't we see it?
Wow. That's a good question. I think part of it is that, again, there is a tendency to want to be pessimistic as we look forward. Today we have 3D printing and ever faster communications, ever cheaper computers. All of these things, cheap or even free education now, thanks to online courses.
And information that's free now all over the world.
And cheaper energy, which is the foundation of modern society. You add all of these things together, and I think we are poised, particularly here in the U.S., for another American century, because we have all of these things in spades that other countries lack.